Mr. Speaker.
Minister Kit Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has made it one of his chief priorities to strengthen police numbers over the next 3 years by 20,000, starting with 6,000 by the end of March 2021.
Jessica Morden.
Mr. Speaker, Gwent Police's budget has been cut by 40% in real terms since 2010, so the government plans to recruit will only take us back to where we were in 2010, if that. What assurances have ministers given Gwent Police that this programme and, importantly, pension costs will be funded after the first year?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to say that Gwent Police are already up 42 police officers on last year's budget settlement, and there's a further 62 target of 62 that have been allocated in the latest funding round. Announcements about police funding will be made as usual in early December, and I'm confident that there will be smiles all round at Gwent Police when we do.
Man.
Mr. Speaker, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Devon informed us demonstrating innovation in rural policing. I think it's fair to say that rural policing hasn't always had its fair share. Can I ask the Minister of State if Cornwall, and more importantly North Cornwall, can have its fair share of these 20,000 officers to make sure that our policing can be brought up to speed? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is quite right to highlight that the Police and Crime Commissioner, the excellent Police and Crime Commissioner, I have to say, I've met her several times now for Cornwall, is over in Portcullis House demonstrating what a great job the police do in that part of the world. He is, I'm sure, aware that there's been already an initial allocation of police officers to his county force, and there will be more news to come. We are in conversation with the policing community more widely about the allocation of police officers for years 2 and 3 of the Uplift programme. And once that is concluded, I'll let him know.
Field.
At my weekend surgery, a constituent who'd phoned the police time after time after time against neighbours from hell living above him realised at one moment of desperation he had a hammer in his hand, and that had he used that hammer against these neighbours from hell, the police would have turned up, no doubt very, very quickly, and he would have been the object of their attention, not the neighbours from hell. When I meet the Minister tomorrow to discuss extra police for Birkenhead, would he give a commitment not only to the numbers, but they should actually stand on the side of decent citizens and not on the side of neighbours from hell?
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right about the police standing on the side of decent citizens, and when I hear distress calls from across the country about people who aren't getting the response that they require from the police, I refer everybody, of course, to the Police and Crime Commission in that particular area, who is responsible for performance and priority in the police force in question. Happily, he will, I hope, know that 200 police officers have been allocated from the Uplift to Merseyside Police as a target for them to recruit over the next 12 months or so, and there will be more to come when we settle years 2 and 3. Like him, I want to see more police officers patrolling in Birkenhead, particularly in Hamilton Square, which has fond memories for me as a child.
Raymond Chishti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Police officers are on the front line of defeating terrorism. The Minister will join me and all others here in welcoming the news of the demise of Baghdadi, the leader of the evil, vile, barbaric organisation Daesh. My question to the Minister is this. Military action alone is not going to defeat Daesh. In 2015, I led the campaign to get the terminology right. What step is the Minister going to take to ensure that the further work that goes on to defeat the idea, the ideology, the appeal, which sucks in vulnerable individuals from around the world and here in the UK, continues?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I well remember the persistent questioning by the honourable gentleman from the backbenches of the former Prime Ministers, plural, to get the terminology right about this particular mission. He is quite right that we all need to work together on a multi-stranded approach to prevent young people being seduced into these evil ideologies or in fact, practices across the world, and the police are in the forefront of that. I hope and believe that some of the measures that were put in place to bind the police as closely as possible into society will assist in that mission.
Louise Haigh.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In July, on the steps of Downing Street, and again in his heavily criticised speech in front of new police recruits in West Yorkshire, the Prime Minister promised 20,000 new police officers for the front line. But a leaked Home Office letter suggests that as many as 7,000 of these recruits will not be going to local forces. With the budget now scrapped, it's anyone's guess if and how these officers are going to be recruited. So can the Minister tell us, will every one of those 20,000 officers be going to the front line, as promised by the Prime Minister, Yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady makes a good point about the allocation of police officers across the whole piece of policing. And I know that every single warranted police officer regards themselves as being on the front line, whatever job they may or may not be doing. She will know that we've allocated the first 6,000 police officers to territorial policing. There is, though, a conversation to be had about further allocations specifically to serious and organised crime through the National Crime Agency and to counter-terrorism policing, and what the balance needs to be between those and the territorial forces. I wouldn't regard any one of those functions as non-front line.
Andrew Jones.
Question 3, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I would like to group this question with questions 7, 18 and 23. We are determined to end county lines and announced a £20 million package of initial measures to do so. This will expand the National County Lines Coordination Centre. It will help target the transport network and go after the profits from this crime, as well as supporting young people to exit county lines.
Andrew Jones.
North Yorkshire Police has had recent success arresting 6 people in a county lines operation in Harrogate. Breaking the gangs that operate county lines is obviously critical, but so is supporting the addicts who are at the end of the line and those who are exploited into dealing as well. Does my honourable friend agree that it is through tackling both supply and demand that progress will be made in dealing with county lines?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right, and I gather that he was involved with his local constabulary in the apprehension of a drug dealer on East Parade in Harrogate quite recently. I'm glad to see he's on the front line too. He is right that we need a balanced approach towards tackling the harm that drugs causes in our society. While that does include enforcement and indeed disrupting the business model of those involved in promulgating this awful trade, we absolutely have to provide support to young people to get them out of the habit, or indeed prevent them even getting into this trade in the first place. And there are significant resources being devoted to this, not least through the Early Intervention Youth Fund, which is putting hundreds of millions of pounds behind these kind of projects.
Mr. Speaker, the Home Office has a number of UK-wide initiatives to combat a range of problem drug use factors, including county lines, or you might even refer to it as country lines, because of course it affects the whole United Kingdom, and there are people suffering from this, from drug gangs coming as far as to the north east as Banff in my constituency. With the SNP's stated policy of decriminalisation, possession and consumption of controlled drugs, however, what effect does the Minister think such a differentiation in Scotland would have on those UK-wide efforts?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman was present at the Scottish Affairs Select Committee when we discussed this matter in some detail, and he will know, therefore, that my view is that having a different regime in Scotland than that in England and Wales could cause significant problems for Scotland, not least because it will become a target for those who wish to promote this trade more easily and running county lines from England into Scotland. There are times when we are 4 nations and times when we are 1 country, and on drugs we should be 1.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sussex Police was recently in receipt of a Home Office grant to tackle county lines drug offences. Will my right honourable friend update the House, please?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is a doughty defender of Sussex Police. I know a great supporter of the brilliant Police and Crime Commissioner there, Katie Bourne, who's doing a fantastic job. He's quite right that Sussex has been in the forefront of the fight against county lines, and they have received significant funding, £900,000 through the Early Intervention Youth Fund, and also £1.3 million to support police operations in the area. I'm happy to say that in the latest week of intensification of action against county lines, which I hope you noted the other week, Sussex Police made 29 arrests and safeguarded 50 vulnerable individuals.
David Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm deeply concerned about the county lines drug gangs from Bradford and Liverpool bringing drugs into my constituency. Can my right honourable friend outline how she expects the £20 million funding package announced will stop these gangs and support victims in Morecambe and Lunesdale?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his question. I too am concerned about the situation in Morecambe, not least because, like Birkenhead, it has happy memories for me as a child. I would be quite keen, though, to sit and talk to the Honourable Gentleman about what more we can do in Morecambe, not least because we're in conversation with Merseyside Police about action we want to take on county lines. And obviously, many of the lines into Morecambe will be run from my hometown. It strikes me it's a town in a particular situation because there are limited points of access over bridges and by road, and that gives the police a significant opportunity to identify and apprehend criminals before they even get there.
Keeper.
Our July Select Committee report warned that county lines were spreading violence and drug networks into towns, not just in cities. In Castleford, in my constituency, where we held a meeting, I called a meeting with the police, local schools and community representatives, there was a real sense that this problem is getting worse in our towns. Residents reporting overt drug dealing on the street and in town centres, and a concern not just about the halving of our neighbourhood police, but also that the youth endowment fund he has announced is tiny compared to the cuts in the youth service. Does he accept there's a real perception across the country that the government's drug strategy simply is not working, and unless they invest in the youth service as well, they will not turn this problem round?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the Right Honourable Lady will have heard, I did, in answer to a previous question, talk about a balanced strategy towards drugs, which does take into account enforcement, but also youth intervention. Having said that, there is always more that we can do. And alongside the expansion of the County Lines Coordination Centre and some of the action that we're going to be taking over the next few weeks as part of the general uplift related to the £20 million of funding that we've received, we have established a County Lines group at the Home Office, which is bringing all those partners together who we think can have an impact, not just in policing but beyond, to have a real push, because we're under instruction from the Prime Minister to bring this phenomenon to an end.
Crawley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member of the Health and Select Committee, last week we published our report recommending a radical change in the UK drugs policy from a criminal justice approach to a health approach. Now, given the high rate of drug-related deaths in Scotland, does he accept that the current UK policy is simply not working and that a new approach is desperately needed?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said at the Select Committee, the Scottish Affairs Select Committee, my mind is open on what more we can do. But having said that, there are lots of things that should be done and that aren't being done. One of the common phenomenon in countries who have had success in dealing with drug-related problems is investment in health treatment and in recovery. And sadly in Scotland that has not been the case over the last few years. There are lots of things, as I said at the Select Committee, that the Scottish Government can and should be doing. And given the scale of the problem in that part of the United Kingdom, I'm surprised that they're not putting more effort and more resources, frankly, into treatment and recovery.
Mr. Speaker, we've twice heard about the Minister's early days as a youth in Liverpool. The fact of the matter is he's got to grow up fast, because the wicked people behind drugs in this country are big gangsters. And the people that killed those 39 innocent people in that refrigerated van, they are big players. When is this government going to tackle the wicked men and women that run crime in this country, and to do it effectively?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I hope the honourable gentleman has seen some of the recent successes that we've had in dealing, exactly as he says, with some of the really big gangs that promulgate this trade, not least the National Crime Agency having its biggest ever seizure of drugs that were being shipped in, funnily enough, through Liverpool in fruit and veg lorries. But there is always much more to do, and he will, I hope, be encouraged by the fact that both the Home Secretary, myself and the Minister with responsibility for serious and organised crime are working very closely together to see what more we can do to do exactly as he says, take this business out from front to back.
Caroline Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. County Lines has invaded every town and city across the UK, and it doesn't discriminate against the lives it affects. South Wales Police, my own excellent constabulary, are seeing children as young as 13 being arrested for involvement in County Lines operations. We must protect young and vulnerable from this exploitation. No matter what the government thinks it's doing, it's not enough. We need to do more to protect young people from this dreadful County Lines epidemic.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is exactly right. Thankfully, her local police force will have more police officers next year to help with this effort. And I know that one of the key focuses of all police forces who are involved in dealing with this awful phenomenon is the safeguarding of young people. Obviously, I'll be working closely with colleagues from health and education to see what more preventative work we can do. But in the end, I do believe that there's quite a lot more we can do around disruption of the business model that will make it more difficult for people to deal drugs, more difficult for them to launder the money that's involved in this trade, and therefore they are less likely to promote it in smaller towns and villages, concentrating in urban areas where we can then get to work on it.
Oh, Greek Cogill.
Speaker, we were delighted.
Victoria Atkins.
Thank you. We were delighted to announce Nicole Jacobs as our designate domestic abuse commissioner, and the role was initially advertised as part-time because we understood from advice from recruitment advisors that that would ensure the widest range of candidates. We have, however, said in our response to the Joint Committee and indeed here at second reading that we have a very open mind to whether or not the role requires a full-time position, and obviously the Bill Committee starts tomorrow, and no doubt we will look into that in detail.
Yeah. Greek Cogill.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the appointment of Nicole Jacobs to the role to champion the needs of survivors of domestic abuse. As a social worker, I know that children are at serious risk of long-term physical and mental health problems as a result of witnessed domestic violence. So what steps is the Minister taking to ensure the Commissioner is given the powers and resources to properly support the 1 in 7 children and young people under the age of 18 who have lived with domestic abuse at some point?
I'm extremely grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising this. We know that domestic abuse is one of the primary adverse childhood experiences which can have such a terrible knock-on effect for a young person's life in the future, and of course the impact it can have on their own relationships. This is why one of the many reasons we are giving the Commissioner the power to require information from public authorities and also to oblige public authorities and indeed central government to respond to her recommendations within 56 days of her making them.
Joanna Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, I like the Minister a great deal, but I think what she just said in terms of that she was advised by the recruitment agency that you'd only get the widest range of candidates if it was part-time is hogwash. We know that abusers and those who exercise coercive control do not do that on a part-time basis. This needs to be a full-time position, and I hope that when this goes through the committee stage, the Minister will see sense and it will become a full-time position.
Well, may I thank the Honourable Lady, and the feeling is mutual, and I look forward to working with her on the Bill Committee. This decision was made in the best of faiths, and as I say, the joy, if you like, of appointing the designate commissioner ahead of the House's scrutiny of the bill means that these issues can be teased out. As I say, we approach this very much with an open mind, and we'll see what the evidence says.
Amy Stone.
5.
Mr. Brandon Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I'll answer this along with question 11. The EU settlement scheme is designed to be simple and straightforward for people to apply through, and the government is also putting in grant support to a wide range of voluntary and local community organisations, as well as digital support and telephone support through the Resolution Centre itself.
Mr. Speaker, as a Remainer, I do wish that the EU citizens in my constituency were not put in this position. Now, as the Minister has mentioned, applications can be made via phones or via iPads. But in my constituency, and I've raised this time and time again, the connectivity is absolute mince, to use the Scottish expression, in parts of my constituency. We'd be better off with 2 cans and a length of string. Can the government see that this lack of connectivity really mitigates against these EU citizens who want to remain?
Well, I would say to the honourable gentleman that people do not have to do things digitally. They can speak to people, they can send things in. We also have several hundred centres that people can go to, but I would just say to me, you can join us in encouraging the Scottish National Party to support the Prime Minister's work to see broadband rolled out more widely across the country so that Scotland can benefit in the way the rest of the UK can.
Alex Chalk. There, man. Mr. Chalk.
Sorry, thank you. What is it? Number 11, I think, Mr. Speaker.
Up with proceedings. He's been grouped. His moment is now. His opportunity to orate has arrived. Mr Chalk.
The settlement scheme is progressing apace and 2 million or so people have signed up to it. But for those individuals in my constituency who really benefit from that face-to-face contact, what steps have been taken to ensure through pop-up shops or whatever it is that they can get that vital hands-on support that they really need?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll say to my honourable friend, yes, that there is a programme of work that the Home Office is doing through these voluntary organisations with a £3.75 million scheme, working with people with pop-up events. I visited one myself in Great Yarmouth, which was excellent, working with the community so that people can see how simple this system is, be able to apply, and we encourage more people to do so. But it has now reached 2.2 million applications, and I look forward to seeing that grow very quickly again in the future.
From Stone to Chalk to Cherry. Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Introducing digital-only proof of status will cause many problems for EU citizens and low digital users in particular. The Home Office's own assessment of creating a digital-only Prove Your Right to Work service said that there was very strong evidence that this would cause low digital users a lot of issues. So does he agree that the same would apply to the EU settlement scheme, and will he reconsider the provision of physical documents?
Well, I'll say to the right honourable lady, obviously when people apply through the settlement scheme, they do obviously get an email confirming that their application has been processed and dealt with. It is done digitally. As we are moving to a digital system more generally, I think that is the right way. It does work for employers, and the fact that 2.2 million in just a few months will already apply through the scheme, I think confirms that.
Joanna Cherry.
In Scotland, the Scottish Government have taken a number of steps to reassure EU citizens, and the First Minister launched a Stay in Scotland campaign, which provides practical advice and support to EU citizens during this uncertain time. The Scottish Government has also announced funding for a new programme in Scotland called Settled, which is designed to target vulnerable EU citizens and to offer them help with applications to the EU settlement scheme. Does the Minister welcome this initiative by the Scottish Government, and will he be doing anything similar in England?
Well, I would first of all say to the honourable lady, she shouldn't be using the kind of language she does. Actually, there is no reason for anybody to have any concerns or be unsettled. We've been very clear we want EU citizens to stay. That's why we've introduced this scheme, to ensure we protect their rights. That's why we're putting £9 million into that work with the voluntary groups, as well as the 3.75 into being able to make sure we get that message out there. And I'm happy to work with anybody that wants to make sure that we are spreading that message positively and properly. And that's why 2.2 million have already applied for this scheme. And I look forward to seeing all 3.5 million processed as quickly as possible.
Crab.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The money that the Minister's made available is very welcome, the money for voluntary groups, but does he also recognise there's a specific concern around hard-to-reach groups, elderly people in care homes, people working in rural areas, in agriculture and in construction? So does he recognise that there's a need for real outreach to ensure that all EU citizens have a chance to clarify their position in law?
My right honourable friend makes a very good point. He's absolutely right. One of the pieces of work we are doing with the voluntary groups, but also through the Resolution Centre itself, is looking at how we can make sure we are reaching all of those vulnerable and harder to reach groups, particularly in rural but other areas as well, working with local communities, including pop-up events. As I say, I've seen one in my own constituency, to reach out, to reach as many people as possible. So people have got till December 2020 to apply for this scheme. I think it'd be good to get 3.5 million through that as quickly as possible.
The Minister will be aware of the very genuine concern of EU nationals, their families and their employers about the workings of this EU settlement scheme. The Minister will also be aware, as will be members on both sides of the House, about the general problems with delays with the Home Office. For instance, the proportion of leave to remain applications taking more than 6 months doubled between 2014 and 2017. The Minister has said, correctly, that over 2 million applications to the EU settlement scheme have now been made, but 18% of those have not been resolved. And the Minister did cause concern by himself saying recently that EU nationals who fail to apply before 2020 could be deported. Can the Minister give the House an assurance that every effort will be made to reach out to those who have yet to apply, and that the applications will be processed promptly?
Well, I would say to the right honourable lady, the short answer is yes, and just to give a bit of flavour to that, there are no delays with the EU settlement scheme. She's conflating two completely different schemes, in fact, in the question that she asked. The EU settlement scheme people's status is decided very, very quickly. There is 2.2 million have now applied through the process. Actually, in the whole of this process, with the latest set of figures, only 2 people have been refused, and that's been on criminality grounds, and I think that's absolutely right.
Sarah Champion.
Question number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, we have listened carefully to the debate on the legal age of marriage, and we continue to keep this under review. Tackling forced marriage is one of this government's priorities, and I'm proud that we made forced marriage an offence in 2014.
Champion.
The Minister is aware that 350 children a year are married in this country. We don't know how many of those are forced. We don't know how many unregistered marriages there are or how many overseas marriages there are. The Minister can change this instantly and change the culture around it by making the legal age for marriage 18. Will she do it?
Well, I thank the honourable member for her question, knowing as I do the work she's doing on this. We are very much looking at the evidence on this. The figure actually for the last year for which we have figures in 2016 was that 179 people aged 16 and 17 entered marriage out of nearly 500,000 people who got married that year. And in a way, her question demonstrates the complexities of this very difficult subject. But I'm very, very keen to work with her and others in the House to look at the evidence on this important issue.
Does the Minister really believe that it is still appropriate for children to marry with parental consent before they've completed mandatory educational training up until the age of 18?
Well, my honourable friend has rather demonstrated the paradox in age legislation in our country. I take some comfort from the fact that marriages under the age of 18 are on the decline in this country. We know that is sadly not the case elsewhere in the world, but I'm very happy to work with my honourable friend and indeed other members across the House on this very, very difficult, thorny but important topic.
Number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, there is strong evidence that place-based approaches can be an effective means of preventing a wide range of crimes, including acquisitive offences such as burglary and theft. This is why, on the 1st of October, my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, announced the £25 million Safer Streets Fund, which will support the communities worst affected by these crimes to implement effective situational prevention, such as street lighting and home security.
Old Marketplace and Rutland Street in Great Grimsby. These 2 streets have experienced incredibly violent knife crime and the on-street killing of a homeless man. Will Operation Galaxy, launched by Humberside Police today, look at what changes need to be made to the built environment so my constituents can feel safe again? And in light of the £25 million announcement, how much money will Humberside Police be getting?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said in my opening remarks, she's quite right that small design changes or indeed equipment such as CCTV can have a huge impact on crime. We know, for example, that alligating can result in a 43% reduction in burglary. Now, I was sorry to read that the Honourable Lady was burgled earlier this year as well. What we're going to do with the fund is basically encourage applications from those areas of the country that are most significantly affected, particularly by acquisitive crime, and encourage them to come forward on the basis that 5% of the worst affected account for 23% of all offences, and I will look forward to entertaining a bid from Humberside Police.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister will be aware that there is a plethora of evidence that you can design out crime both in the built environment and in the design of objects. The Secretary of State for Health recently launched the National Academy for Social Prescribing to link healthcare with the arts and creative industries. Can the Minister update us on the work the Home Office is doing with our world-beating creative industries and arts in order to help combat crime?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in typical fashion, the honourable gentleman poses an intriguing challenge, which I will have to research in the department to find out if indeed there has been any impact. However, one of the areas that I do know we could do more work in is a significant contributor to the cultural life of the nation is with the architectural profession, who very often do not put crime prevention at the top of the requirements when they're putting in place a development, and where they very often should.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the greatest casualties of a decade of cuts to policing has been the breakdown in partnerships between local authorities and mental health trusts. So what discussions is he having with those departments to ensure that there is investment in those services and shared funding to move those services forward?
Well, Mr. Speaker, she's quite right that the rise in the incidence of mental health has caused significant problems across the country, not least to the police. And certainly the frontline response teams that I've seen met over the last few months in this job have all highlighted to me the problems they have in dealing with mental health cases. There are, though, some parts of the country where the problem has been sorted, not least my own county of Hampshire, where there is a good relationship between the organisations there such that they're functioning well, and I'd like to take that best practice and spread it.
Dan Main.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. He mentioned being able to get designing out crime. What more can be done by linking up with local councils to ensure that not only are the buildings designed, but the landscaping around the buildings are designed to try and minimise crime and make places more pleasant to visit for people that are going there?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady raises an extremely good point, and it's often the case that a well-functioning local criminal justice partnership, which will involve the local authority as well as the police and other bodies involved in crime fighting, will look at exactly these kind of issues. I hope that as we move forward in the Police Uplift programme, one of the areas of focus will be a regional approach to problem solving in policing, and I'd be more than happy to meet and discuss if she has any specific ideas.
Foxcroft.
Number 12, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, we are confident fire and rescue services have the resources they need to do their important work. Operational decisions are for each fire and rescue authority to make as part of the integrated risk management planning process, and it is for individual fire and rescue services to make decisions on the number of firefighters they employ.
Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since Grenfell, London Fire Brigade has undertaken focused and enhanced visits to high-rise buildings using both station-based crews and fire safety inspecting officers. Inspecting officers are highly skilled individuals who ensure that those with responsibility for buildings are taking the necessary steps to uphold fire safety standards. So what is the Minister doing to support brigades in recruiting and retaining officers in these essential specialist roles?
Well, Mr. Speaker, obviously the Grenfell inquiry is due to publish shortly. We'll all have to learn lessons from the conclusions of that inquiry when it arises. But she's quite right to point towards prevention as a key part of the mission, if you like, of the fire service, and one that has been enormously successful over the last decade or more in driving down the number of fires, particularly that are attended to, but generally incidents across the board. We have secured an extremely good financial settlement for the fire service across the country this year, and I have urged fire chiefs, not least in the light of the first ever set of inspections for some time, to invest in prevention.
Davis.
Speaker, I certainly support the government in recruiting an extra 20,000 police officers. But can I ask the Minister to look again at the resources for the fire service, because they certainly are in West Yorkshire, and I suspect in other parts of the country too, extremely stretched at the moment. The number of people on a fire engine is going down to try and mask over these stretched resources. So can I ask him to look again, because the fire service need extra resources in the way that the police do too?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would expect nothing less than a challenge from the champion of Shipley on my portfolio, as he has done in the previous portfolios that I've had. I'd be more than happy to look at particular problems in his fire service if he believes there is one. But we have instituted recently and had the results of the first inspection regime of fire and rescue services for some time, which has been reassuring in parts, but does point towards particular areas that we need to address. As I say, we had a good settlement for the Treasury this year from a financial point of view, and it will be for local fire and service chiefs to decide how they invest that extra money.
Number 13, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government is committed to recruiting 20,000 new police officers over the next 3 years with energy and pace. This reflects the biggest recruitment drive in decades, and I know my honourable friend will welcome the recent announcement that Sussex Police have been allocated another 129 officers in the first year of this programme.
I thank the Home Secretary for her answer. Will she join me in welcoming the announcement from Sussex Police that they intend to use their extra funding to reintroduce PCSOs across towns and villages in Lewis?
Well, my honourable friend is right, and yes, the government is more than supportive of police plans to increase the number of PCSOs and their presence across towns and villages in her constituency, in Sussex and across the country. And on top of that, this is all about how, through our new police recruitment drive, we can do more to keep the public safe and increase police visibility.
Whilst I'm delighted to hear about the increase in numbers of police in Sussex, could she reassure me also that the London Borough of Merton will see its increase in officers, and will she join me in supporting my campaign to keep the police station in Wimbledon open so that those police officers will have somewhere to operate out of?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I can also say to him that I know he would welcome the increase in police numbers, over 1,300 for the Metropolitan Police Service, and of course this is now all about local police presence and ensuring that we have more officers on the beat, which will be exactly what will happen in his borough.
Sir John Hay.
Thank you. Question 14, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is crucial that our security and law enforcement organisations do have the tools needed to keep our people safe. And there's a review of powers that was undertaken as part of our updated comprehensive counter-terrorism strategy contest. And in February this year, the Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Act received royal assent. That ensures that our security and intelligence agencies, prosecutors and the judiciary have the powers they need to counter this threat.
Sir John Hayes.
Speaker, identifying indoctrination by Islamists and similar fanatics is essential to providing the good order which Edmund Burke characterised as being the hallmark of good government. The Minister will know that the prevent duty on local authorities obliges them to play their part in that effort. Will he, mindful of the fresh guidance that's been published, and I have it here, Mr. Speaker, will he now review the practice by those public bodies, identify what's going well, and sanction those who are not doing their duty?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a very important point. I know he was instrumental in the prevent duty and its introduction and delivery through that is to the benefit of everybody, particularly at a time where obviously there is work for us to do on extremism, including the unwanted growth in right-wing extremism that we want to see brought down. And therefore, we are always looking and reviewing at how these programmes work to ensure that we are making sure that everybody has the best ability to be kept and remain safe.
Nick Thomas Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. International action is, of course, required to tackle terrorism. And paragraph 78 of the political declaration as it stands refers to a balanced security partnership after Brexit. But the reality is that 3 years on, the government is no further forward in agreeing the security treaty promised by the former Prime Minister and hasn't put forward any ideas as to how to reconcile the UK's position as an EU third country with the level of security cooperation we have now. With the continuing risk of no deal, isn't the government's attitude to our future security arrangements little short of negligent?
Well, I'm disappointed that the honourable gentleman and his colleagues didn't vote for the programme motion the other day so that we could have actually got on with the withdrawal agreement bill to get towards delivering on a deal with the EU to ensure that we get a good outcome. But the government's work to prepare for no deal has continued with meetings on a daily basis to ensure that we are ready for when we leave. We have excellent agencies, good working across Europe and indeed globally, and the work we do through Interpol as well plays an important part as we go forward.
Lawrence Robertson.
Question number 15, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, we expect all crimes reported to the police to be investigated appropriately. Chief constables and police and crime commissioners are responsible for ensuring cases are investigated properly. Together with the Crown Prosecution Service, they must make sure cases are charged where there is sufficient evidence and it's in the public interest to do so.
Mr. Robertson.
Thank the Minister for that answer, but the Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act 2014, Section 176, makes theft from a shop of goods worth £200 or less a summary-only offence. And according to the National Federation of Retail Newsagents, shoplifting crime, has increased since then. Will the Minister have a look at that and see what's going on and see what can be done to reduce retail theft?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman has been a persistent champion for those involved in the retail trade who are subject to crime, and I will be more than happy to look at the point he raises, not least because if the data shows there is a problem, then we have to do something about it. I would just say to him, there is though one matter that I can bring to his attention. When the Westfield shopping centre opened in West London, there was a concern about crime, and I recommended that all employers there gave time off to their shop staff, or some of them, to become special constables because on that basis they will always have a police officer on duty.
I'm sure that the honourable gentleman is greatly gratified to know that he is not merely a champion, but a persistent one at that. Mr. Chris Bryant.
It feels, unfortunately, as if the police and the Crown Prosecution Service still think that an assault on an emergency worker is a low-level crime. And that, frankly, often magistrates say, well, a little bit of violence is just in the way of doing your job. Surely we've got to reverse this trend when there's an assault on an emergency worker, and it's an assault on all of us.
Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman speaks for us all. In my view, anybody who raises a hand in malice against an emergency worker should face the severest possible penalties.
Order topical questions. Craig Tracy.
Topical number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to begin by remembering the 39 people who died in the horrific circumstances last week trying to reach the United Kingdom. The thoughts of the whole country are with them and their families, and I'd like to pay tribute to the emergency services who've responded with such professionalism. Our focus now is to bring the perpetrators to justice.
Tracy.
Can I welcome the recent police number increase across Warwickshire, which will see 191 new officers recruited? No, my constituents will particularly welcome the creation of a rural crime team in North Warwickshire. So will the Secretary of State join me in congratulating our excellent Police and Crime Commissioner Philip Seckham and Chief Constable Martin Jelly for this fantastic initiative which will make our local area even safer than it already is?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to praise his Chief Constable and his Police and Crime Commissioner. And actually, I would like to extend thanks to them for everything they have been doing with regards to making a difference in the local community. And that also means being part of our scheme and initiative to, of course, recruit 20,000 more police officers. So I'd absolutely welcome that.
Aaron Lee.
You've got to come. Mr. Speaker, we're over 2 years on from the Grenfell Tower fire, and insufficient regulatory reforms and continued cuts to fire services haven't given the local community any reason to trust this government. There must be scrutiny of processes and resources, not just blaming of individuals. Advice to residents on the night was to stay put as part of a strategy of containment, and we need to be absolutely clear here. This is government policy, not fire brigade policy or a policy dreamt up by firefighters. As promised after the Lakanal House inquest in 2013, that's what, 6 years ago, will the Minister commission a review into the stay-put policy as a matter of urgency?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as you may recall, I had some responsibility for the changes, the enormous changes that are required in building regulation and fire safety procedure when I was Minister for Housing, and I would dispute the Honourable Lady's representation that nothing has happened. There is a huge amount of work going on under the auspices of MHCLG to make sure that this kind of thing can never happen again. Having said that, the inquiry will be announcing shortly, and no doubt there will be implications for all of us, frankly, about what more lessons can be learnt.
David Amis.
Following time spent patrolling Leigh-on-Sea Broadway on Friday with 2 excellent police officers, would my right honourable friend now look at the availability of accommodation for people with mental health issues detained under Section 136 and perhaps a more simplifying of criminal behaviour orders?
I thank my honourable friend for going out on patrol and obviously supporting Essex Police in everything they do locally. He is right, and of course we are working with the Department of Health and Social Care to consider recommendations from the Mental Health Act review so that people in mental health crisis can receive the right support that they need. We should stop criminalising these individuals and make sure that we are working across all institutions and local communities as well to ensure they have the right kind of help and support.
Jarvis.
Claire Throstle's abusive husband murdered her 2 young boys, Jack and Paul, by burning down their family home. It's impossible to put into words the pain that she suffered as a consequence. So can I ask the Home Secretary or the Minister if she agrees with Claire that we urgently need the domestic abuse bill to put an end to aggressive cross-examining and to ensure that children's voices are heard in the family courts so that no one else has to suffer the same pain that Claire has?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've had the privilege of meeting Claire and indeed her Member of Parliament, set out Claire's case and the names of Jack and Paul in the second reading of this important bill. We very much take on board the points that Claire and others make about the workings of the family courts. We have some measures in the bill already addressing some of those concerns, but we are very much looking for the Bill Committee and the House to scrutinise our proposals so that we make sure that family courts are a place of justice for victims of domestic abuse and their children.
Craig Whittaker.
Areas of the Calder Valley like Stainland, Todmorden and Ripponden, we've seen a rise in recent years of rural crime. Whilst the announcement of 20,000 extra police officers is very welcome news indeed, can my right honourable friend tell me what the strategy is in the meantime to tackle the rise in rural crime?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. He is right. Rural crime blights rural communities and also harms the rural economy too. The National Police Chief Council's Rural Affairs Strategy is intended to do exactly that, to support rural communities and provide greater focus when it comes to policing. And of course, I would urge West Yorkshire Police Force, through the new funding for police recruitment, training and engagement, to invest in rural crime prevention.
Alex Cunningham.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the new contract for asylum seeker support in the North East, but the Home Secretary, be aware there's still considerable anxiety because of the lack of guaranteed accommodation, long-term accommodation, and long delays in accessing services provided by migrant help. This leaves many, including pregnant women, without adequate support. When's she going to sort it out?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. He will know that through the advice, issue reporting and eligibility service provided by Migrant Help, that was set up to help applicants with their applications, to provide guidance services into a single nationally operated end-to-end service. I very much take on board. I'm happy to meet him to discuss the particular issue he raises, but we want to ensure that applicants get the help they need in the making of their applications so that the right decisions are made as promptly as possible.
Crouch.
Speaker, the Vagrancy Act criminalises vulnerable people for simply having nowhere to go. It wastes valuable police time and resources with the issues that could be far better managed by outreach workers and multi-agency support services. Local police officers tell me they have plenty of other tools to deal with rough sleeping. So with that in mind, can my right honourable friend reassure me that she is engaging positively with MHCLG in its review of this outdated, unnecessary and damaging piece of legislation?
I'd like to reassure my honourable friend that we are working with MHCLG colleagues. The government believes that no one should be criminalised simply for sleeping rough, and in the cross-governmental rough sleeping strategy, we did commit to reviewing the Vagrancy Act. Obviously, rough sleeping is a very complex issue, and we're looking closely on whether all the options, including retention, repeal, replacement or amendment of the Act.
Matters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was a little perplexed to hear from the Fire Minister early on that he thought that fire authorities had a good settlement from the Treasury this year, because we're looking at losing the second pump from Ellesmere Port. So I would like him to join with me in lobbying the Chancellor for extra funds for the fire service for next year so we can keep this vital service.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to hear that that pump is going, but presumably that's an operational decision made by the local fire chief and fire board. We did get a 2.3% settlement, which in the great scheme of things was good for the fire service, but there is always more investment that can be looked at. And one of the key issues of areas of investment that I've talked to the fire service about that's of interest to me is about technology. What more can we invest in to make them more efficient, their ability to fight fires better, and make sure that all forces are wetted? Mr. Speaker, did you know that there is a chemical you can add to water that makes it wetter and therefore more effective in putting out fires?
Well, what an extraordinarily helpful nugget of information the honourable gentleman has vouchsafed to me and to other members of the House. He really is an encyclopedia of arguably useful information. Mr. Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can the Secretary of State confirm that she is working closely with the Lord Chancellor to ensure that the Domestic Abuse Bill goes hand in hand with root and branch reform of family courts to make them more accessible and less intimidating places?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. He has hit upon one of the most common experiences of victims and survivors, namely that the trouble they feel they experience in the family courts. We want to sort this out, which is why, along with the Ministry of Justice and the Lord Chancellor, the Home Secretary and I are bringing this bill forward. And in fact, we will also be looking at the conclusions of the expert panel commissioned by the Ministry of Justice to examine exactly this point, to ensure that family courts and private law courts are places of justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been reports that the Home Secretary might introduce a regional visa system. This is something that the Scottish Government and the SNP have been championing for some time. Is she in a position to provide us with more details on this issue?
As the honourable gentleman knows, immigration is an issue for the whole United Kingdom, and it will be now and after we leave the European Union.
Andrew Griffiths.
Welcome the 90 new police officers we're getting as part of the government's investment. But we do recognise the danger those officers put themselves in every day. Officers are asking for access to tasers in order to keep them safe. Will the Home Secretary commit that any police officer that wants a taser will get one, and when will they be getting hold of them?
My honourable friend will know that the deployment of tasers is indeed an operational matter for chief constables, and it's for them to determine the number of tasers, obviously, for officers. But we have introduced a £10 million taser fund, and that funding will mean that over 10,000 more officers in England and Wales will have the opportunity to carry a taser.
Dodds.
Speaker, farms and agricultural communities are significantly affected by a rise in those crimes. Could the Minister confirm that there will be no significant reduction in funding to those rural police forces, and in fact they need more funding? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, rural police forces will receive the same uplifting and funding that the other police forces do. And as somebody who represents a large and very beautiful rural constituency, I have a particular interest in making sure that rural crime does not remain or does not become a Cinderella part of the service.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend develops a new immigration system, will she ensure that she pays particular attention to the design to facilitate the free movement or the movement of scientists, researchers and technicians in and out of the country to protect our world-class science base and maintain our position as a global science superpower?
My honourable friend makes a very good point, and yes, the Home Secretary has commissioned the Migration Advisory Committee to look at that future-based, points-based system, which is intended to be not a geographical, therefore, system of immigration, but one that's based on the skills that this country needs so we continue to be globally leading, but also globally open.
Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister have any plans to bring legislation that all specialist housing and registered care accommodation, both new and existing, be fitted with sprinklers?
Minister Mulhouse.
Mr. Speaker, this area of policy actually falls within the purview of the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, and I know that as part of the review, having been Housing Minister until recently, as part of the review of building regulations, the matter of sprinklers is under consideration.
Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Shropshire has suffered widespread and dangerous flooding over the last few days, affecting thousands of people. Would the Home Secretary like to put on record her thanks, joining me thanking West Mercia Police and all the people from Shropshire Fire and Rescue?
Absolutely, I would like to put on record my thanks and gratitude. Flooding is a dreadful, dreadful issue. It has an appalling impact on people's lives, livelihoods and their homes. And of course, our fire services, our emergency environment agency and police officers as well would have done a great deal of work to provide a great deal of support and comfort to local residents.
Bambos Charalambos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a constituent whose mother is in her 90s. She came to the UK from Poland after the Second World War as a refugee. She now has dementia and she needs to apply for settled status. She has very few documents proving her residency over the last 5 years. So can the Minister advise me what she has to do, or people such as should have to do, to acquire settled status?
Well, would be delighted to actually look at that application directly with the Home Office, but we do also have 57 voluntary organisations that are being resourced by the Home Office to actually reach individuals who, will not necessarily be able to access technology easily. But as I said, I'll be very happy to look at that individual case.
Jack Lepresti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the confirmation of additional funding for counter-terrorism in the spending review, and ask my right honourable friend what steps she is taking to counter terrorist content online?
My honourable friend makes a very good point. We are determined and we are focused on making sure we do everything we can to ensure we keep all of our citizens safe, and he also rightly highlights the threat to all of us of the online environment and the work that we need to do with our agencies right across the board. And there's great work being done, not just by the National Crime Agency but by other agencies as well, to ensure that we are continually working to make sure that this is a safe environment. But we all have a part to play in that, and it's something we will continue to be focused on, both in finance and in terms of policy and legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a direct result of government cuts, some fire brigades have cut the crew per pump from 5 to 4 and even 4 to 3. This is not just an operational decision, it's a direct result of cuts. How sustainable is it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the exact disposition of the number of firefighters on each appliance is an operational decision. It is, and it's not my job to sit in Whitehall and decide how each fire service should run its particular operation. What I can tell him is that we have instituted the first inspection regime of fire and rescue services for some time, which specifically looks at effectiveness and efficiency and the ability of that service to perform its function. Now, lessons will be learnt from those the first round of inspections of each of them, and I hope and believe that will improve the service.
Having called the honourable member for Filton and Bradley Stoke in order to avoid marital disharmony, I must call the honourable lady, the member for Morley and Outwood, Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you for that, Mr. Speaker. A few weeks ago, a young girl got stabbed in my constituency. The family are quite rightly frustrated as the suspect is walking free while awaiting charges, while their young daughter has had to be put in foster care for her own safety. Would my right honourable friend please meet with me to discuss how we can reunite this family? Thank you.
Well, I'd like to express my sympathies to the family concerned, and that is a dreadful, dreadful tragedy. I would, of course, be delighted to meet with her and with the family as well to hear much more about this particular case.
Is it still a government aspiration to be a member of Europol?
Well, I would say to the honourable gentleman, we have put out a very ambitious programme of work for our future security arrangements. I would just say to him there are other countries like the United States that has a relationship with Europol, and in fact has got the biggest attendance there, I think, at the moment. So Europol for the United Kingdom is still an important part of our future, as part of our future negotiations.
Well, we must move on from questions to the Home Secretary to the statement by the Home Secretary. Statement the Home Secretary, Secretary Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to update the House on the investigation into the tragic deaths of 39 migrants discovered last Wednesday, in Essex. This morning, the Prime Minister and I visited Thurrock in Essex to sign the Book of Condolence and pay our respects to the 39 individuals who died in the most appalling circumstances in trying to reach the United Kingdom. These were people's sons and daughters, their friends and families. Victims of brutal and unscrupulous criminal gangs, they have paid the ultimate price. We have been confronted with the stark reminder of the evils of people smuggling and human trafficking. This trade is a blight on the modern world, and for the sake of these victims and for millions like them, we must do all we can to stamp this out. And I would like to pay tribute once again to the outstanding professionalism shown by all our emergency services, and in particular to the swift and professional response from the East of England Ambulance Service, Essex County Fire and Rescue Service, who have been leading the ongoing criminal investigation, and our operational partners who are working round the clock to assist the investigation, including the National Crime Agency. The families of the victims at this incredibly difficult time are in all our thoughts, my thoughts, and have my full sympathy. Nothing can ever undo the loss that they have suffered. We owe it to them to identify those responsible and ensure that they face the full force of the law. And I want to work with those families to ensure that they can bring forward any evidence that they might have to help solve this appalling crime. With their help, we can bring the perpetrators to justice. And I'd also like to remind colleagues that this is going to be a long and meticulous investigation. It will, as I've heard from Essex Police today and I heard last week as well, this will involve working with partners overseas, with foreign law enforcement agencies, and unravelling the threat of criminality that could stretch halfway across the world. We are already working with a range of operational partners to piece together information. The police themselves, Essex Police, will need to be given the time and the space to do just that, whilst respecting the dignity of those who have died and, of course, the privacy of their families. The process of identifying the victims is continuing, and I would like to stress, Mr. Speaker, that their nationalities yet, at this stage, have still not been confirmed. And on Friday, 3 further people were arrested in connection with the incident. A 38-year-old man and a 38-year-old woman from Warrington were arrested in Cheshire, while a 46-year-old man from Northern Ireland was arrested at Stansted Airport. All 3 were questioned on suspicion of manslaughter and conspiracy to traffic people and have now been released on bail. The driver of the vehicle was 25-year-old Maurice Robinson from Northern Ireland. This morning he appeared at Chelmsford Magistrates Court via video link, charged with 39 counts of manslaughter, conspiracy to traffic people, conspiracy to assist unlawful immigration, and money laundering. He has been remanded in custody and is next due to appear at the Old Bailey on the 25th of November. Mr. Speaker, following the devastating discovery of the lorry at Tilbury, the Home Office has set up a dedicated team to coordinate an immediate response and long-term response to this tragedy. I can confirm that Border Force are also increasing their presence in Purfleet. They too are working alongside Essex Police to gather further information regarding this incident. And the Home Office now will also accelerate our joint intelligence lead operation between the police, the National Crime Agency and Immigration Enforcement, which aims to disrupt and deter organised crime gangs using refrigerated and hard-sided lorries to smuggle clandestine migrants. I would like to stress once again that the nationalities of the victims has not been confirmed at this stage, but work is underway to coordinate the international response to this incident. I have already spoken to my Belgian counterpart, Minister de Crème, to invigorate the work that is taking place across both countries. And I can confirm to the House that as of today, I have received agreement from the Belgian authorities to deploy extra UK immigration enforcement officers to Zeebrugge. I have also been in contact with other international partners to offer assistance to any foreign nationals who may have been affected by this tragedy. Mr. Speaker, last week's tragedy was the culmination of a broad, more general rise in global migration, but also organised criminality. This is one of the most pressing issues for the UK, but also for all our international partners. Illegal migration fuels organised crime, it erodes public confidence, and most importantly, it endangers the lives of desperate people. The perpetrators conduct their activities under a cloak of secrecy, and the motivations that lead people to try and to cross borders illegally are also broad and complex. They are often the most vulnerable people, and then, of course, they are then further exploited. It is clear that we and all our partners must enhance our response. All areas of government have a role to play, whether it's in strengthening our borders and eliminating the pull factors in this country, or addressing many of the root causes to suppress the demand of illegal migration. We already have an illegal migration strategy in place, but as the tragic events last week in Essex have shown, there is much, much more to do. I will be working across government and government departments this week to plan how we can strengthen our response to the wider migration crisis that led these victims to try to enter the United Kingdom. The organised criminals who drive this practice are dynamic, they are unscrupulous, and they are highly adaptable. But failing to confront them comes with a terrible, terrible human cost. We must be ruthless now in our response.
Thank you. Diane Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Home Secretary for the advance sight of your statement. The events in Essex are a tragic loss of life. All death is regrettable, but this was a particularly gruesome, grotesque way to die, and a horrific experience for the first responders. Many of us in the House will have seen the images in our media over the weekend of desperate communities who are frightened that their young people may have been in that lorry. And many of us will have seen the messages from persons to their families on the verge of their own suffocation. One woman said, "Really, really sorry, Mum and Dad. My trip to foreign lands have failed." I'd like to thank the Home Secretary for the information about arrests and that there has also been some progress made in identifying the victims. But as the investigation is ongoing and criminal charges are involved, I will not say more about this specific case. As Home Secretary has said, people traffickers are particularly ruthless and simply do not care about human life. I was in Lesbos last year looking at the people trafficking from Turkey across the Mediterranean to Greece, and the people traffickers deliberately not only took very large sums of money off desperate people, but put them in completely unseaworthy rubber dinghies, gave them fake life jackets, and did not care. As inevitably happened, very many of them died in the Mediterranean. The people traffickers are greedy, ruthless, unscrupulous, and have a callous disregard for human life. I would, however, like to ask the Home Secretary, is the Home Office going to be looking at security at some of these small East Coast ports? Because it does seem to be, I don't want to preempt the police investigation, but it does seem to be that these small East Coast ports are being used because there is less security than at ports like Dover. I also want to ask the Home Secretary about the current cooperation with the European police, security and justice agencies in investing this case. Specifically, can I ask the Home Secretary how closely our agencies, the police forces and the national crime agencies are working with Europol in this investigation? Can she also indicate the level of cooperation with the European Migrant Smuggling Centre, which is an agency of Europol, and how our agents benefiting from cooperation with what is the most sophisticated agency of its kind in the world? And can the Home Secretary further explain how this cooperation can continue in future under either a no-deal Brexit or the Prime Minister's deal? Because as it stands, we will lose the current level of cooperation, we will not have real-time access to EU agency databases, we will lose access to a host of criminal databases, and we will lose access to the European arrest warrant. So the House would like to know what plans the Home Secretary has going forward to maintain and, if anything, strengthen that level of cooperation. This is a very, very tragic event, and in some ways it has humanised the issue of people trafficking for many people in this country. Of course, we have to bear down on the people traffickers. They are ruthless, have no concern for human life, but we also have to look at issues like how we make those eastern ports more secure and how we can guarantee people the same level of cooperation with EU agencies that we currently have.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Honourable Lady, the Right Honourable Lady, for her remarks. There are a number of points and comments that I would like to make. First of all, she's absolutely right about the first responders. They cannot unsee what they have experienced and seen through this awful crime. Secondly, she is right to recognise the scale of trafficking and the inhumanity. There is no other word that can describe what has happened, but the inhumanity of the perpetrators behind this crime, but also behind modern slavery, people smuggling, human trafficking as well. She specifically asked about checks at eastern ports in particular, those ports that are not like or not as vast in size and have the the large numbers of freight necessarily coming through. She would have heard me remark in my statement that Border Force themselves, with regards to Purfleet, will obviously now be increasing their presence, but also alongside increasing their presence, they will be also working with Essex Police in terms of the targeting the response that they need with regards to the actual incident itself, providing further information with regards to what has happened. She also asked the question about security and drivers in terms of working in cooperation, working in partnership with other agencies, and of course that is exactly what we are doing right now. The National Crime Agency rightly is taking the lead on this particular investigation. As I said in my statement, this is a complicated investigation. There are a number of agencies, not just across the European Union, but others that also we are working with because of the routes that have been taken. I've got no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that over time we will hear much more. There is going to be a lot more information that will come out in due course. But she did also specifically ask about Brexit and security cooperation. I would like to just say to the House, Mr. Speaker, that of course the way in which we can absolutely ensure that we have the strongest possible of cooperation is by having a deal, which is the government, exactly the government's position, and would also like the Honourable Lady and her party to support that. But I think when it comes to future cooperation, when it comes to security tools, there are no boundaries when it comes to our cooperation. The United Kingdom will remain one of the safest countries in the world, but also, Mr. Speaker, a global leader on security.
Jackie Doyle-Price.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for the leadership she's showing across government on this issue. There's been lots of talk over the last few days about the security to our East Coast ports, but does she agree with me that it matters nothing how much security we put in there when these people are being trafficked through numerous countries before arriving here and going through continental ports? Isn't it something that all jurisdictions need to step up to the plate and deliver on?
I thank my honourable friend for her comments and her question, and I thank her as well. As the constituency Member of Parliament, we were together this morning paying our respects and condolences alongside the Prime Minister. She will know, as the local Member of Parliament with Purfleet and Tilbury, based in her constituency, that the challenges are vast, they're absolutely vast, and she has highlighted the fact that we could have a huge amount of port security, which we do across the country. However, we have a major international issue here, which is the fact that organised crimes, serious organised gangs are exploiting vulnerable individuals across the world who want to seek a better life in another country, and they are the ones that have fallen victim in this case.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary for her statement and for advance sight of it. Like her, the thoughts of myself and my colleagues in the Scottish National Party are with the families of the victims, who it seems are far away and are at the moment desperately trying to gather information about what might have happened to their loved ones. It's very difficult, Mr. Speaker, to fathom what it must be like to lose a loved one in such dreadful circumstances. And I would also like to join the Home Secretary in paying tribute to the response by the emergency services and expressing my concern for their well-being, given what they have seen. I'd like to associate myself with what the Home Secretary said about the gross immorality and inhumanity of people smuggling. And I'm going to speak about the specifics rather than this case, as it's an ongoing investigation. But as the Shadow Home Secretary has said, an international trafficking and smuggling network can only be broken up through international cooperation, and I know that the Home Secretary recognises that. She will also recognise that the European Migrant Smuggling Centre, which is part of Europol, has been at the heart of this inquiry and inquiries into tragedies such as this. And a Europol source has been quoted saying that investigators at Europol are working round the clock to try to put together the pieces of the puzzle. Now, I know the Home Secretary is keen for us to support the deal for leaving the European Union, but that deal does not adequately address what plans the government has to work with these vital EU institutions in the future. And it simply will not do to say that America has a relationship with Europol, because, Mr. Speaker, America is not in Europe. We are. Now, Mr. Speaker, The UN's trafficking envoy has said that withdrawing from Europol and Eurojust could curtail the UK's ability to conduct the transnational investigations required to dismantle smuggling networks. Does the Home Secretary accept that leaving the European Union will make investigations such as these more difficult? If not, will she take this opportunity to clarify, in the way that she was unable to do before the Home Affairs Select Committee last week, about what relationship she thinks the UK should have in the future with these institutions following Brexit? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Lady for her comments with regards to the actual incidents in Essex and obviously the issue that is at hand in terms of people smuggling and the 39 deaths. With regards to her comments about security cooperation, I'm going to re-emphasise and restate that we continue to be one of the safest countries in the world and will be a global leader in security. She asked about Europol. We can continue to work with Europol when we leave the European Union. It is possible for third countries to do that, and there are very good examples of other third countries, including the United States, that are doing so.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is indeed a terrible tragedy, and of course, our hearts go out to all the families concerned. Can I thank the Home Secretary, my right honourable friend, for praising the outstanding professionals in our emergency services. Please can I also thank all those at Chelmsford Magistrates Court, where the case has been heard this morning, the Essex Coroner and her deeply dedicated team, which is based in Chelmsford, all those working on the investigation at Essex Police Headquarters, also in Chelmsford, and the staff at Broomfield Hospital, which is just outside my constituency, in the Saffron Walden constituency, but nevertheless where many of my Chelmsford constituents work. I understand that the bodies of the victims have been taken there. It is very clear that this incident will impact on very many people. Can the Home Secretary confirm that all support and resources will be available both in the short and longer term?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I thank her for highlighting the wide range of local organisations across the county of Essex, her own constituency, as well as neighbouring constituencies that have been involved in this terrible, terrible, appalling tragedy, including those within the NHS, the coroner herself too. We have discussed on several occasions actually since last Wednesday, and with the Prime Minister this morning in fact, the type of support that will be put in place, because this is not short-term support for the individuals that have been affected, the individuals that are now part of this investigation and the inquiries and the post-mortem that's taken place, ranging from the trim process with the police and the ambulance service, but also in terms of welfare service provision that will be put in place, not just for today, but actually for the long term, for everyone that's been involved in providing much vital support to the police for this investigation.
The Home Secretary will be aware of the disturbing news that children have been found in another refrigerated lorry yesterday, this time at Calais, reportedly already suffering from mild hypothermia and luckily found before it was too late. It's these refrigerated lorries that are particularly dangerous and make this such an appalling crime. But can she say, is it correct that there are hardly any checks of refrigerated lorries taking place at the moment at Zeebrugge, that at Purfleet there are still not 24/7 checks taking place, and she still hasn't explained what work is being done with Europol's European Migrant Smuggling Centre. Is she working with them, and does she agree we should continue to participate in that centre after December 2020?
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her comments, and let me be clear to the House. Any form of trafficking and smuggling of individuals is completely wrong, and she has rightly highlighted the appalling use of refrigerated lorries, and that's effectively what we have seen in the case she's mentioned, but also with what happened in Essex last week. The fact that these containers have been used and are being exploited by criminal gangs is a major issue that affects not just this country but other countries too. She asked about checks. There are checks and have been checks that are being made when it comes to refrigerated lorries, not just in the UK but in other ports. She will appreciate, though, right now, with the investigation that is taking place and the links with the Belgian authorities, there is much more information to come forward, specifically for the vehicle that came through, the container that came through that particular port. There are checks as well that do take place in Zeebrugge. I have already said in my statement that we will be escalating our work. There is a plan in terms of working with my Belgian counterpart to address the specifics of security issues in Zeebrugge itself and how we can extend more checks if required, although that is an operational decision not just at the port but with the Belgian authorities. And with regards to her question about cooperation, it is right that we cooperate internationally with all partners and all agencies. So yes, that work is absolutely underway, and there must be no doubt that even after when we leave the European Union, that cooperation will continue. I, as Home Secretary, will not move away from high levels of cooperation. We will work day and night to make sure that we have the right processes, the right structures in place to ensure that that international collaboration continues and grows.
Andrew Mitchell.
Speaker, the heartbreaking texts and final messages underline the abject misery, terror and horror of this modern slave trader practice. Looking to the future, isn't our honourable friend for Thurrock absolutely right that we do need to handle this, above all, with a new international convention, since current international arrangements are outdated, ineffective and patently not fit for today's needs?
My right honourable friend is right to raise this issue as he has done previously, and it is clear to say that this is just not a specific issue for the United Kingdom. This is an international issue, and while there is a great deal of work that takes place internationally, whether it's through global compacts or through migration funds, there is much more work that we can now do, working collaboratively not just with international partners now but with our friends and allies to absolutely deal with the root causes, the upstream issues, and actually look at how we can deal with the criminality as well, but look at what we can do to put into statute globally, internationally, to actually stop this from happening again.
Vernon Caker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our outrage at what has happened continues. The latest statistics from the National Crime Agency showed that the top nationalities for the potential victims of trafficking were the UK, Albania, Vietnam and China. Given what we may or may not know, can the Home Secretary tell us what discussions she's had, in particular with Albania, China and Vietnam, about what's going on and what more can be done to stop it?
Friend is absolutely right, and he will know through his own work, through the all-party parliamentary group as well, that there are specific countries, he has named some of them, that are the source countries where we see far too much trafficking and criminality. There are a range of discussions that are taking place. I have been involved in some of those discussions. I'm not going to reel off all the individual ones. There'll be many that will follow as well. I would also like to emphasise to the House, Mr. Speaker, that outside of the Home Office there is much more that can be done across other government departments, and I'm absolutely pursuing that this week because, quite frankly, we've seen various streams of activity from other government departments, but we now need to join this up to ensure that we speak with one voice to many of these countries, but also have a much more coherent approach.
Jones.
It's been reported that the lorry in question entered the UK at the port of Holyhead before travelling on to Purfleet to collect the container. Given that the United Kingdom and Ireland are part of the same common travel area and will remain so after Brexit, can my right honourable friend confirm that North Wales Police are and will remain adequately resourced to provide a sufficient presence at Holyhead to deter and detect activities such as this?
My right honourable friend for his question and the points that he has made. Absolutely, because of course resourcing the police to support Holyhead. It's just part of the process, not just in terms of, and it's not just about this investigation, but how we can ensure that we have the right level of security and the right measures in place as well, so that police officers and others, including Border Force, can act on that intelligence that they do find out. I think it's worth, Mr. Speaker, just reiterating something that I have said previously in my last statement on this. We are, of course, working with PSNI as well in this investigation, and that also speaks to many of the links with not just the investigation but with the police forces too.
Wayne David.
Can I thank the Home Secretary for her statement? A number of the 39 victims may well have come from Vietnam. If that is the case, can I, as chair of the all-party group on Vietnam, offer my heartfelt sympathy to the victims and to the families. We know too that the Prime Minister of Vietnam has just announced an inquiry into human trafficking in his country. Can I have a commitment from the Home Secretary that her government will fully cooperate with the government of Vietnam to make sure this terrible business is eliminated?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his remarks and also for the work that he is doing through the all-party parliamentary group. Although the nationalities have yet to be confirmed, as I've touched on in my statement, we will, of course, work with all our partners collaboratively. I myself have already spoken to the Ambassador for Vietnam in the UK. There are many discussions that are underway, which he will understand are very sensitive at this particular stage. But when it comes to any particular inquiries into human trafficking, people smuggling, of course, we will be working in cooperation with them.
Simon Hoare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Secretary's referenced Northern Ireland. And in that context, could I ask her to assure me that the Criminal Assets Bureau will have all of the resources that they require to play the full part in the investigation? And would she agree with me that it is now time that unexplained wealth orders were in force in Northern Ireland as the rest of the United Kingdom?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very, very important point. And, of course, when it comes to criminality, there is more that we must always do when it comes to seizing cash and assets of the perpetrators that are responsible. And he is right. I think absolutely there is much more that we can do. And at this stage right now, we will look into everything in light of this inquiry, this investigation. But also I will continue to hold discussions with the Ministry of Justice in terms of how we can upscale some of this.
Steve McCabe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the question of utilising intelligence, there have been reports over the weekend that local people near the Waterglade Industrial Park had previously reported seeing migrants dropped off from lorries and indeed had found discarded foreign passports at the site, and yet these were not followed up. Could the Home Secretary comment on that?
Well, I'd say to the honourable gentleman that we have had no formal reports of things of that nature, but obviously where there is evidence of wrongdoing, bond documents being discarded, and any evidence of that nature, we will of course follow that up.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one could fail to be moved by these terrible, terrible stories of young lives that were literally snuffed out. And I appreciate that the Right Honourable Lady cannot say where the victims came from, but I know that some victims in the past have been identified as coming from Vietnam. And the UK has a very strong ministerial dialogue, strategic dialogue with Vietnam. Can the Home Secretary make sure that at the next agenda we discuss, she discusses with her officials, how we communicate jointly to these young people not to make the dangerous journey?
I can say, Mr. Speaker, to my honourable friend that that dialogue is already underway. And it is right that it's underway in light of the terrible tragedy that has taken place.
Jamie Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Human trafficking is indeed a terrible crime, and the perpetrators must be brought to justice. Ironically, it is some of those victims who've already arrived in this country who know most about these criminals and their methods. If we could get them to turn Queen's evidence without fear of being or retribution or being deported, that would assist us hugely. Would the Home Secretary agree with me that we should look at mechanisms where this might happen without them being too fearful to come forward and help us?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his points that he has just raised. I can give the House the assurance, Mr Speaker, that he is absolutely right, and also on that basis for this particular investigation, that's exactly how we'll be working.
Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. These containers are moved around, not necessarily on the back of a lorry, but parked in ferries and so on. Could my right honourable friend assure me that the authorities, the border force, the police, and indeed the drivers of these lorries do have the means and the competence to open these containers if necessary?
My honourable friend raises important points. There are a number of areas to the support, not just for lorry drivers, but there's a lot of work that takes place through road haulage associations across the EU, in the UK as well, in terms of giving and providing information and intelligence in terms of what to do in situations of this nature, but also how to protect themselves as well from trafficking. I can give my honourable friend plenty of assurance that there is a great deal of work that takes place in this field, and if there's anything else he'd specifically like to know about the Home Office's work, Border Force's work, and how we work collaboratively with many organisations on this front, I'd be very happy to write to him.
Diana Johnson.
Mr Speaker, Hull has a very long and proud tradition of fighting the evils of human trafficking and slavery. Indeed. Many of my constituents have been in touch to say how shocked they are about what happened in Essex, and they want to know, with the Port of Hull, are there now additional checks that are going to be carried out, particularly on those refrigerated containers, because we know now that those traffickers seem to be moving their attention to the ports on the East Coast?
Well, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right, and she will know through her own constituency with the port there in Hull too, that there are various challenges now that have been highlighted. I think, first of all, it's important